Welcome to The Daily with me, Neil Patterson, and today we're returning to a topic we've previously covered, the significant, indeed historically high, level of absence from our schools. But we're going to be focusing very specifically on children who've been suspended, that is, those who've been asked to leave the school temporarily. And figures show that more than 1 million days of learning were lost last year through suspensions alone. These days, pupils who've been suspended or even permanently excluded are educated through what's known as alternative provision, a sort of catch-all term, which essentially means education outside school arranged by local authorities or schools themselves. But such are the numbers being suspended that there is now a lack of alternative provision, meaning there are certainly kids falling through the cracks in mainstream education and parents at their wits' end. In a moment, I'll be speaking to Nick Martin, our People and Politics correspondent. But first, let's hear from one mum struggling with her daughter's regular suspensions from high school. She doesn't want to be identified, so for our conversation, I referred to her as Jane and her daughter, Leah. Jane, thank you so much for talking to us. Just tell us a little bit about the problems that your daughter has been experiencing.
My daughter, who is actually adopted, we adopted her when she was quite little. She really started to struggle as soon as she started high school in year 7. Because of her background, she does have mental health difficulties, but pretty much straight away entered into a cycle of detentions, which then led on to isolations, which then led on to suspensions. And for the whole of year 7, really, she's gone round and round in that circle, where altogether she had about 5 suspensions last year, which is roughly sort of near to 5 weeks of missed time in school. We wanted to ensure that she was learning while she was suspended, but that's then a strain on home, having to make sure that she's doing that as well as us holding down our jobs as well at the same time.
As I understand it, the school did set up what's known as alternative provision for Leah. I mean, how did that work out?
So it worked very well the way that they initially set it up, because it was in a completely different part of the town where the school is. The way that it worked was it provided that nurture and that care that the children seem to really need. When it stopped working, however, was when the provision was moved back to the mainstream school, because then you've gone back to the massive building, the thousands of other children, because it is a very big high school, the hundreds of other adults, and it's just very overwhelming for certain children. She's got to the point where she will say she doesn't care. She's very disaffected by the school system. We are extremely worried as parents as to where this will ultimately lead to, because we don't know what the solution is. At the moment, she's in an isolation, so the next step will be another suspension, and I just don't know what the future is going to hold for her. I personally feel that the zero tolerance approach to behaviour that has been encouraged in high schools isn't helpful for a lot of children. And I think there is a problem in high schools in particular of children truanting, and I know that absenteeism in schools is a massive issue at the moment, and I think it is all linked.
Jane, this is clearly having an effect on you, taking its toll on you, imagine physically and mentally. What are your greatest fears if Leah doesn't get back into mainstream education on a regular basis?
We have a duty to make, as her parents, to make sure that she gets an education, but I don't know how we can do that if we are both working and we need to continue with our jobs. But I don't know what is out there for her, what options are out there for her to ensure that she has got an education other than one of us being at home with her and homeschooling her. I think the impact on our family would be huge, both financially and I just don't know how to do it. And you're trying everything. It's just a scary future because I don't know what we can do to support her. We adopted her wanting to give her the best possible future that we could, and we feel that we could be letting her down if we're not able to do that.
Thanks, Jane, and we wish you all the very best. Time, though, to bring in Nick Martin, our People in Politics correspondent. Nick, take us through the numbers, because at first glance, frankly, they're almost unbelievable.
The figures are, I think, a warning sign that there's something very seriously wrong in some of Britain's schools, and that is involving thousands of children. So the other week, as we do, we will mull around story ideas, and our producer Fiona said, just have a look at these education figures. More than 1 million days lost last year because people were suspended. Now, having done this for a few years, I was a bit sceptical about that figure. Whenever I see a huge figure like that, I was like, well, let's have a look at that figure. And there it was, hidden away in the Department for Education stats. 1.1 million days last year lost by children who'd been suspended. And when we say suspended, just for the sake of clarity, that's expulsion from school for a set period of time. The view is you might come back. Permanent exclusion is you're out forever.
1.1 million days. And just again, just to be absolutely clear about this, purely through decisions taken by head teachers to suspend for a day, 2 days, a handful of days.
Yeah, that's right. Probably for bad behaviour. The majority are boys, to be honest, although our figures show an absolutely alarming trend of a rise in girls now being suspended from school. So that number is up 60% since before the pandemic. And that is a really interesting thing for us to look at. Why are girls starting to be suspended from school? It's really been a boy thing. Boys manifest their anger and behaviour at school. They shout and get boisterous. Girls, a lot of teaching leaders tell us they internalise, they quietly get on with it. But now their behaviour is manifesting in the classroom, and that's leading them to be suspended in big numbers.
What is wrong? What is wrong with suspending a bad child for a few days? I'm thinking of schools, for example, where there is a zero tolerance policy on bullying. You know, if I were the parent of a bullied child, I would have absolutely no problem with the person who was bullying him being kicked out for a handful of days and being forced to think about what they'd done.
Well, suspensions can be a way of steadying the ship for schools. When we were at school, people would be suspended or expelled, and we used to
present company accepted, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I might have come quite close to it. And we someone might have had a period of time outside of school.
Yeah.
And as a parent myself, I don't want a disruptive child in my kid's class impacting on his education. The problem is, where does that child go in 2023 when they're suspended? So what we've seen over the last few years is a policy shift in trying to put a safety net underneath kids who've been suspended. And that's called, it's a horrible phrase, but it's called alternative provision. They go somewhere else, commissioned and paid for by that school, where they might learn an alternative timetable, plastering, bricklaying, or something like that, hair and beauty, and then they can try and continue their education. There's been a massive boom in that. The extreme of that is pupil welfare units, for the most extreme. In lots of towns and cities now, they are overcommissioned. They're full. So you're right, there's perhaps nothing wrong, really, in suspending a child who's disrupting a class. But the question these days is, where do they go? And teachers are increasingly facing a problem of there's nowhere for that child to go. The alternative is they drop through the net.
And presumably some of the pupils that are contributing to more than 1 million days of learning lost are repeat offenders, that they are not simply suspended for a couple of days and that's it, done and dusted, but they're suspended time and time and time again.
A lot of the children I met at the Marvel School in Hull the other day were children who'd had a sort of long history of being disruptive in school over several academic years. And this was now the last chance saloon for them, being put in this alternative provision that I'm talking about. These are children who are coming to school. We don't know what's going on at home, but we do know that there's a high chance that there are issues at home that are manifesting themselves at school. And as I say, it comes down to this critical decision of what the school does with that child. Do they let them go and fear that there's nowhere for them to go? Or do they try and save money? Because remember, the school has to pay to let them go? Do they try and save money and deal with the children in-house? And that's what we're seeing increasingly now.
I mean, my parents were both teachers, and it does feel like nowadays, particularly if you're working in the senior management team, if you're a head teacher, and indeed we're going to be speaking to the head teacher at Marvel College in a few moments' time, it feels like you're almost having to do the job of social services right now, rather than the job of educating. I mean, why should it be down to schools to have to handle this stuff? If the parents are incapable of handling it, then surely that's the point at which social services would naturally intervene.
There is actually a heavy social service presence in school these days. There are children who will have a social worker who will be under CAMS, children adult mental health. They might be being helped by the school. They might be getting alternative provision. So there's lots of support around some children who need it. But the school is shouldering the day-to-day pastoral, mental, physical well-being of these children if it's not happening at home. And that begs the question, a lot of parents might think, is how much of that resource is taking away from the education of the rest of the children in the school? And that's a big headache for schools. Remember, they're under an enormous amount of pressure to come up with results. And disruptive children could affect that.
I mean, of course, the whole point of these alternative provisions, I imagine, is, to save some of these kids, to stop them from falling through the cracks. And as your reporting has demonstrated, that has certainly happened. Tell me about Lacey.
So I met Lacey the other day in Hull. Now, 2 years ago, she was on the brink of being permanently excluded. She was coming into school. She was swearing at teachers. She was throwing chairs around the classroom. There was even an allegation that she'd assaulted a teacher. Right. So there was lots going on. Dig into Lacey's background, and she's one of 5 siblings. Her mum is holding down a full-time job. The money is not... they're not flush, this family. Father is not on the scene. And she felt that she was carrying a lot of sadness around, taking that into school, and that was turning into bad behaviour.
Everything just came out. Once all the sadness turned into anger, and I just started being real naughty. I was very, very, very close. Like, if I got like one more yellow card, I think, or something it was, I was permanently excluded. If I shouted at someone else, I was gone.
She was put on this alternative pathway in the school, segregated from the rest of the children, educated with a fully trained teacher, one-to-one, tailored timetable, go a couple of days and do hair and beauty at the college. And it worked for her. 2 years on, she gets GCSEs, she's now going to college, She wants to do an apprenticeship and one day have her own business. So for society, it could be argued that it was worthwhile.
Thanks, Nick. In a moment, we'll be back talking with one head teacher taking a fresh look at how his school deals with the more difficult pupils. Well, as we've been hearing, over 1 million days of learning were lost last year through suspension alone, so little wonder that in some areas they're attempting an alternative approach. Well, one of those schools trying to do something just a little bit different is the Marvel College in Hull, and its head teacher is Jake Capper. He joins us on the Daily. Jake, great to have you on. Just walk us through what you've been doing at the school to try and deal with this problem of suspensions.
So the ARCS is our in-school provision for children. We label it as support, not sanction. So we don't have a kind of isolation, that traditional sort of booth where kids are away from the school. Our ARC is a provision that's staffed by an assistant head teacher, a manager, and it has a variety of children in there. So it has children who are struggling in certain lessons with their behaviour. It also has children who have mental health issues, anxiety, school refusers. So the mix in there is quite diverse. It's not just naughty children per se. It's children who are just struggling with the rigour of school life. They might be in there for 3 or 4 hours a day, depending on their needs. So if we've got someone who's persistently been absent from school, is it realistic that we expect them to come back to school full time if they've not been in school for 6 months? The reality there is they're probably unlikely to be successful. So for a period of time, they might go into the ARC until their confidence builds.
It sounds a remarkable idea, and if it's working the way that you say it is, all power to you. But you must be under huge pressure, though, at the moment, in terms of budget, in terms of staffing. What does that kind of that degree of alternative provision do to educational provision in the rest of the school?
I think for me, it's kind of a risk. Of course it is, because we've invested a lot of money in the staffing down there. We've invested a lot of money in the resource base. But ultimately, that risk becomes a positive self-fulfilling prophecy. So by having that resource and by being able to support our most vulnerable children, it means our staff in the classroom can teach. It then means that we're more attractive to teachers, because then they see the behaviour around school and they think, wow, this is a school that understands children and knows how to manage behaviour. It then means that they can concentrate on their bread and butter, not having to worry about low-level disruption, which then ultimately results in staff staying in your school longer. And the hope with that is that there's less staff absence and cover costs go down. So yes, it's a risk. Have we invested a lot in it, and have we taken money away from other resource to invest in it? Yes. But ultimately, will it return on its investment? Well, if it doesn't, the children still get a better deal. So for me, I can go to bed at night and be consoled with that. But if it does, then great.
Sounds fantastic. But to pick up on something that you said earlier, and of course we cannot generalise about all children in any school, but just how strong is the link between the deprivation, of which there is an abundance in Hull? How strong is the link between deprivation and the types of behaviours that would ultimately lead to you being suspended?
I think, well, the facts speak for themselves, don't they? If you're from a deprived community or an area of high level of deprivation, then you're more likely to be suspended. I'm not a sociologist or a research expert by any means, but I think if you and I look at my own circumstance, if I look at the experiences I can provide my children, sports clubs, structured holidays, all that kind of thing, the fact that a lot of our children don't get that experience, one of the things I often use with our staff is, what is the experience of a disadvantaged children? What's their experience of an adult? And for me, it's they're told off, told what to do, or ignored. So if you're a child and it's not every child, of course it's not, but if you're a child from disadvantage, you get home, you might be ignored because your parents are super busy or don't have time to deal with you. You get told off because you're in the community and you're getting shouted at. Or when you get to school, you're in trouble. So what happens when you're in trouble? Well, you get told what to do. You get less autonomy as a student. So that's their experience. And if that's your experience on a daily basis, what's likely to happen? Well, at some point, you're going to snap, you're going to kick off, and as a result, there's a good chance you're going to get suspended. So it's a vicious cycle.
The work by our correspondent Nick Martin does more than suggest, it shows that girls are now being suspended at a historic rate, that the number of girls that are being suspended has increased significantly. Why might that be?
Again, it's anecdotal from my perspective, but I think that the peer pressure that girls face now, the social media thing, Snapchat, TikTok, all that kind of thing, almost makes female students want to be a little bit more rebellious. And because of the way social media and TikTok is set up and people's bravado around how they present on these platforms, quite often they're backed into a corner. We certainly saw that after COVID, that people were saying things on Snapchat or on TikTok or whatever. I do this, I do that in my school. And then they almost have to live those behaviours into reality. And we're seeing that more in school. Higher levels of aggression with girls.
Jake, what would you say to those who look at what you're doing in Marvel College and suggest, look, you're spending an awful lot of money, there's an awful lot of resources going into what are essentially naughty children. Why not just simply suspend them from school for a week and have done with it? And if they're at home alone, then that is the responsibility of the parent or parents.
I think I'd say that's not why we got into the job of teaching and why we work with young people. If I suspend or permanently exclude a child, and I'm not saying that at times that's not a necessary resource that you have to use, because it absolutely is. I'm responsible for 1,300 children and 175 staff, and they need to be safe and secure that they can do their job and come to school happy. But if I suspend or permanently exclude, am I in any way solving that problem, or am I just making it worse and passing it on to somebody else? And as a number 9 on a rugby pitch, we don't shovel the proverbial. We put it up the jumper and we do what we can to make sure that we're protecting our team. And for me, that's what it's all about. We don't pass the buck because someone else is going to have to pick it up either next week, a year down the line, or whenever.
Thank you, Jake. Nick Martin's still here. And Nick, as we have covered previously in the Daily, there is a far broader problem of persistent absence plaguing schools in England and Wales, isn't there?
1.7 million children are now persistently absent from school. There are 125,000 who are severely absent. That's basically they're out of school more than they're in school. And that's what prompted us to start looking at this year, is why that's the case, what are the causes, but what are the solutions? Now, the other month, the schools minister, Nick Gibb, went before the Education Select Committee, and the Select Committee asked him, when are you going to get these numbers back down to what they were before the pandemic? And he couldn't tell them. There's no timetable for that, which is leading to school leaders and certainly the opposition to suggest that the government perhaps doesn't have a good enough plan to come back from this. And each day that a child's absent from school eats away at their life chances. And that's why it's an important story for us to look at.
And that's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you next time.